Tonight, we shall delve into that war proclaimed to end all wars, to touch its core, unknown, dark side. Forget those posters of heroes charging and steadfast soldiers. The deepest wounds of this war come not from shrapnel, but from the thunderous roar that precedes it, shaking the very marrow. The truth is, the first to collapse was not your body, but the nerves that held you together. Frankly, it was an endless waking nightmare. So before you unwind, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy my content, of course. Tell me in the comments where you're from, and what time it is there. Witnessing the global audience join is always mesmerizing. Flip your phone over, volume set to whisper. Let us delve deeper. To comprehend trauma, one must first understand the wounded psyche. The minds of those marching to war in 1914 brimmed with curiosity and confidence. A product of the long, sunny afternoons of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, this psyche was built upon certainty, progressivism, and an unshakable faith in the forward march of industrial civilization. This psyche believed it had categorized the world with meticulous order. Not even the fragility of its own inner workings was spared. In the gloomy consulting rooms of London, Paris and Vienna, doctors expounded with cool authority on the nervous system, imagining it as a precise electrical network, a finite reservoir of energy. Overworked, moral decay, or disordered living could all deplete its reserves. For the leisurely gentleman, the artist, or the overly sensitive intellectual, such depletion of vital energy would induce a fashionable ailment, neurasthenia. This diagnosis signified utter exhaustion. Neurasthenia was a mild, almost poetic affliction, suggesting a certain refined sensitivity. Treatment involved convalescence in the Swiss Alps, seaside retreats, temporary respite from the stimuli and pressures of modern life. In a sense, it became a hallmark of complex, fulfilling lives. Yet for the working classes, particularly women, the diagnosis was starkly different. Their nervous breakdowns were termed hysteria. This term, derived from the ancient Greek for womb, carried a weight of contempt, suggesting feminine frailty, suggesting chaos where emotional torrents breached the dikes of reason. The eminent French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, presiding over consultations at Paris's Salpêtrière Hospital, would demonstrate symptoms of hysteria to his spellbound medical students. Through hypnosis, he induced and alleviated convulsion, paralysis and tremors in his female patients, treating the mind as a malfunctioning machine to be freely adjusted. The underlying implication was starkly evident. Such afflictions afflict not the strong, but rather those of flawed character, rooted in defects of biological neural circuits. True men, be they British gentlemen, Germanic warriors or French lions, forged in the crucible of empire and industrial tempering, possess indomitable will, their nerves cast from harder metal, their resolve fortified into impregnable citadels. The entire societal and military framework rests upon this unquestioned, simplistic conviction. British officers, upon graduating from public schools, are indoctrinated with this doctrine. Leadership lies in unyielding perseverance, in the perpetually unflinching, resolute upper lip. Ordinary soldiers, be they Tommies or Poilus, are required to possess a certain rustic, homespun resilience. Fear is but a fleeting, shameful impulse, to be controlled. Courage, they were taught, was the natural state of a healthy man loyal to sovereign and country. In this world where trauma was not yet recognized as a clinical entity, the closest approximation was the concept of railway spine. This mysterious syndrome afflicted survivors of the frequent 19th-century railway accidents, manifesting as widespread pain and neurological symptom. Doctors fiercely debated whether these symptoms stemmed from microscopic spinal cord damage caused by impact, or mere malingering. To claim compensation from the powerful railway companies, on the fringes of contemporary medical thought, lingered a deeply skeptical notion. the sheer terror of the accident, the shrieking metal, the splintering timber, the very spectacle of destruction might itself inflict enduring, invisible wounds upon the psyche. It was believed then that mind and body were fundamentally separate realms, that wounds must be visible to the eye, must be accompanied by blood, broken bones, shrapnel embedded in flesh. These weren't aimed legitimate human injuries, whereas memory, fear, the intangible world constructed by dreams, belonged to the realms of moral character and spiritual will. Thus this European civilization, proud of its steam engines, telegraph lines, scientific classification systems, and global empire, faced impending catastrophe in a state of profound and perilous unprecedences. It forged a world dominated by mechanical might, yet stubbornly viewed the human soul through a romantic lens verging on medievalis. When the brute force of industrial genius turned inwards, this mindset found no language to describe it, no framework to contain it, no category to encompass what was about to unfold. As the saying goes, across Flanders fields and the Argonne forest, across Europe, the lights were going out, but no one noticed. Among those extinguished lights, were many hidden within the hearts of soldiers marching to the sound of bugles. They carried a simple, yet deadly confidence, from farms, factories, universities and slums into a battlefield unprecedented in human history. This theater of war was unimaginable in any previous conflict. The Western Front was no longer the battlefield of Napoleonic times. No more spectacular cavalry charges or decisive battles. It was something entirely different. A continental minor-scale, industrialized static siege. Along a 400-minor-scale amateur front stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, where churning earth and tangled barbed wire prevailed. This was less a place of combat than a state of existence, an endless grinding in the death factory. Even the air had become strange. The smell of gunpowder, the poison gas, faintly tinged with pineapple and pepper, damp earth, chlorids, lime sprinkled upon corpses, and that sickly sweet stench of decaying flesh. It clung to everything, impossible to wash away. The ground beneath their feet was not solid earth, but thick, greedy mud, a porridge minus like viscosity chalk, minus full of shattered bone, tattered uniforms, and the remains of perished lives. It clings to the soles of soldiers' boots, dragging men into the abyss. In rain minus filled shell craters, its life minus devouring power rivals any ocean. Yet more suffocating than the stench and mire is that ceaseless sound. This sound constitutes the very essence of the New World. Here, there is no such thing as peace. Even on calm days, a low minus frequency rumble perpetually echoes on the horizon. It is the distant artillery shaking the earth, a sound that penetrates to the marrow, the background noise of existence itself. Then, the quiet moments end without warning. Artillery fire pours forth abruptly. The world instantly transforms into a dizzying cacophony of pure noise. This is no mere crackle of single-minus shot muskets or the rumble of solitary cannons. It resembles the simultaneous explosion of 1,000 steelworks. Heavy howitzers emit a guttural growl, those colossal guns firing from miles behind the front lines, their shells tearing through the air. Like freight trains hurtling at full speed, the shrill whine of medium field guns, German 77 guns and British 18-pounders, thundering in mechanical rhythm. Each shell possessed its own distinct character, each unleashing a terrifying roar. High-explosive shells arrived with deafening detonations, the pour icing everything at impact. High-explosive shells burst overhead. Black smoke billowed. Hundreds of lead bullets rained down like a deadly hail of spikes. The soldiers gave them names. Whistlers referred to high-velocity shells striking without warning. Jet Johnsons denoted the massive black smoke shells fired from German heavy artillery. Moaning miners described the dreadful wail of the German trench mortar, the Minuella, during large minor-scale offensive. Artillery barrages could persist for days. On the eve of the 1916 Battle of the Somme, British artillery fired over 1.5 million shells in the week preceding the infantry assault. Imagine, within a mere 7 days, along a front barely a few miles wide, 1.5 million explosions. Not 1,000 times, not 100,000 times. The earth trembled incessantly. Smoke and dust obscured the sky. That sound was not merely heard, it was felt physically. The shockwave hammered the body, crushed the lungs, vibrated the brain within the skull. Soldiers were buried alive by collapsing trenches. Their screams were choked by tons of earth. They were torn to shreds by explosions of terrifying power. Their remains barely recognizable. They watched their comrades, the very men who'd shared cigarette moments before, vanish in an instant amidst the pinkish smoke. Beyond the artillery barrage came the ceaseless rapid minus, a minus out of Maxim machine guns, 100 bullets per minute. The mechanical Sith sweep across the no minus man's minus land, reaping entire advancing lines with terrifying efficiency. In this industrial inferno, humanity was but fragile biological cogs in a colossal mechanical process. Faced with 9 minus in shells, there was no room for individual heroism. The trajectory of machine minus gun bullets could not be evaded. The primary state of soldiers in the trenches was utter, profound helplessness. They took shelter in pits dug into the earth, knees perpetually submerged in frozen sewage, surrounded by bloated rats gnawing on corpses, confronting nameless death at any moment. Sniper bullets, stray shrapnel, collapsing shelters. Sleep became a luxury. Bombing lulls offered only fleeting, terrified respite. Yet the echoes of past sounds and sights remained ever minus present. That intricate neural network, that fragile system which rear medics fancied could be soothed by seaside convalescence, was now subjected to relentless, overwhelming sensory assault, far exceeding the limits of its evolutionary adaptation. Every instinct screamed to flee, hide, seek shelter, but safety is nowhere to be found. The escape route is severed. The only way out is to be wounded, killed, or to witness this war reach its bitter and unimaginable conclusion. The resilient were once deemed the hallmark of the pre-minus war gentleman, is now subjected to systematic, merciless and inhuman dismantling. Thus amidst this seething crucible of noise and terror, altered beings began to emerge. Their wounds defied the understanding of surgeons. No neat lacerations of flesh, no clean fractures, yet shattered at a deeper, more fundamental level, forcing bewildered medical teams to coin new names for this bizarre and terrifying invisible plague. Soldiers stumbling back from the front lines plunged the doctors at the casualty collection point into bewilderment. Their bodies trembled uncontrollably, often convulsing violently, limbs shaking as if in a frenzied dance. Some were rendered speechless, lips pressed tight in a silent scream. This condition would later be termed aphasia. Others developed severe stammering, struggling to form coherent sentences. Some suddenly lost sight or hearing. With no visible injury to eyes or ears, others became paralyzed in the legs, requiring stretcher transport. Though spine and limbs remained intact, they wept without cause, tormented nightly by nightmares, as if dragged back into the trenches abyss. Their nerves lay stretched to breaking point. The slightest sound, a tray clattering to the floor, a door slamming, is enough to send them cowering beneath their hospital beds. Those military surgeons skilled in suturing wounds and setting broken bones are utterly helpless. Their medical textbooks were born in the pre-war era of unshaken confidence, and offer no explanation for this epidemic of nervous collapse. Influenced by their original culture, their first reaction is suspicion. Is this cowardice? Are they feigning illness to escape the frontline horrors? Indeed, some were accused of lacking moral courage. The most extreme cases faced court-martial for desertion or cowardice in the face of the enemy, even facing the death penalty. Yet the sheer volume of cases, and the fact that brave soldiers, officers with distinguished service, and new recruits alike fell prey to this affliction with equal frequency, pointed to more complex factors at play. It was within this atmosphere of chaos and crisis, Cambridge psychologist and physician Charles S. Myers, then serving as a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps, commenced his research. Stationed in France, Myers was one of the few military doctors possessing both medical training and a background in the emerging science of psychology. He began systematically observing and interviewing these soldiers suffering mental collapse. He discovered that the majority, though not all, had experienced the close explosion of enemy shells. They had been blown to pieces, or buried alive, or simply present within the immediate vicinity of a violent explosion. He listened to their accounts, documenting their symptoms: trembling, aphasia, paralysis, recurring nightmares. In February 1915, Myers published a brief yet profoundly influential article in the authoritative medical journal The Lancet, naming this condition. He termed it shellshock. This terminology proved a dual masterpiece of clinical and linguistic achievement, concise and powerful, vividly evocative. More crucially, it offered a plausible physiological explanation for the symptom. The initial theory proposed by Myers and others posited these symptoms stemmed directly from the physical impact of exploding shells. It was believed the blast wave would travel through the soldier's body, directly vibrating and confusing the brain and central nervous system, thereby inducing what was termed concussion, molecular level disruption of neural pathways. This physiological explanation held immense practical value, as it secured medical recognition for the condition, removing it from the purely moral realm of courage versus cowardice. Soldiers afflicted with shell shock were not cowards, but casualties, struck by enemy artillery, their injuries as real as those inflicted by shrapnel. Shell shock briefly became a diagnosable, legitimate war injury, providing physicians with a framework, albeit imperfect, to understand the symptoms, and giving a name to soldiers suffering, validating their invisible wounds as real. The term spread with astonishing speed, from barracks to rear bases. It seemed to pinpoint the essence of modern industrial warfare, a conflict reliant not merely on bullets and bayonets, but upon explosive force and shockwave. The very name suggested modern soldiers were being shattered, their nerves utterly destroyed by the sheer power of enemy weaponry. Yet from its inception, the term's limitations became apparent. Myers himself soon realized this concise physiological theory could not account for all phenomena. He had witnessed soldiers who never came near exploding shells exhibit classic symptoms of shell shock. Many soldiers collapsed from sheer exhaustion due to prolonged stress, constant fear, and the horrors they witnessed. Conversely, many others endured the most violent without developing any neurological symptom. Evidence gradually indicated that the etiology lay not solely in the physical impact of shells, but in the psychological trauma of the experience itself. It was the horror, rather than the shockwave, that proved decisive. The French had long associated this condition with shells through terms like obesity, though neurotic shock or neurotic tremor were more commonly employed to point towards deeper psychological causes. Germany, drawing upon its profound academic tradition in psychology, designated it as neurosis or war neurosis, explicitly linking it to the pre-war concept of psychological trauma. Thus commenced the debate over whether shell shock stemmed from physical brain injury or psychological trauma, a controversy that raged throughout the war and persisted for decades afterwards. Was this a scar of honor earned on the battlefield, or did it expose latent psychological vulnerabilities? Had the war merely unveiled existing neuropathology? The answer would determine everything: the valuation of soldiers, differences in treatment, whether to return to the front, even society's perception of them as heroes or failures. The birth of the term shelf did not resolve the enigma. It marked merely the beginning of a long, painful journey to understand this invisible epidemic of the Great War. When this condition first manifested on an industrial scale, it did not present as a single, clear, minus-cut pathology. No neat catalogue of symptoms for the Royal Army Medical Corps to file away. It was more like a terrifying kaleidoscope, revealing the shattering of the human spirit. A vast, unpredictable inventory of ways the mind and body resisted their environment. This was an invisible plague of trauma. For some, resistance manifested as unrelenting violent tremors. In the field surgical wards of military hospitals, they were held captive by ceaseless tremors, heads jerking uncontrollably, limbs flailing like unbridled steeds, a deathly pantomime lingering after sensory explosion. This was soldiers' convulsions, street Vitus's dance in the trenches. The spectacle was horrifying. Patients strapped within their trembling shells were utterly exhausted, while onlookers felt uneasy. One moment a man's as still as a mountain. The next his teacup clattered against the saucer, his hands shaking as if still clutching a rattling Lewis gun. Others were imprisoned by absolute stillness. Doctors called it functional paralysis, hysterical paralysis. When the wounded were carried into the field hospital on stretchers, their legs were limp and weak. Yet the surgeon's probe found neither severed nerves nor fractured vertebrae. The brain's electrical signals simply failed to reach. His legs had gone on strike, refusing to carry him back to the front. Some froze into terrifying statues, their bodies forever frozen in the posture of their final hellish moments of consciousness. Arms forever bent, as if to hurl a Mills grenade, palms forever clenched, as if gripping a rifle, long vanished torsos forever hunched, as if cowering, shivering in a shell miner's hole. And then there was the silence. Too many had ceased speaking altogether. Aphasia. Doctors diagnosed it as mutism. They had witnessed sights beyond language's capacity to bear, endured such profound, such earth-minus shattering, unceaseless noise, that the mind erected defenses of absolute stillness. They sat by beds and sanatoriums, eyes wide, staring into the void 1,000 miles away, lips sealed tight. Sometimes they could still write, scribbling desperate, frantic notes to nurses, proof the mechanism of speech hadn't yet collapsed, but the voice, the vessel of their identity, had vanished. This silence deeper than any symphony, born of a sound unbearable, its variation stammering, a cruel stumble, turning every utterance into a painful struggle. Men who were eloquent and confident before the war now struggled to organize a single coherent thought. Their words are lodged in their throats, like shrapnel struggling to escape. Each syllable becomes a new trench to be conquered, the senses to have rebelled. Some are temporarily blinded, some permanently blinded. Their eyes remain intact, their optic nerves undamaged, yet all they see is thick, impenetrable darkness. Their world has grown as black as a midnight bunker. Others are plunged into silence. They cannot hear the medic's questions, cannot hear the distant roar of artillery. That roar still echoes through the air of northern France. Their ears are overwhelmed, the gates of perception slam shut, refusing to accept a world defined by the shrieking shells and dying screams. The mind, seeking self-preservation, sometimes conjures even more terrifying illusions. Hallucinations spread like a plague. Some tremble, swearing German soldiers stand at their bedside. Others smell the sickly sweetness of phosgene gas in the newly ventilated wards. Others were imprisoned by recurring nightmares all night long. Scenes of trench raids or shelling were replayed with perfect, high-fidelity clarity. Their terrified screams roused the entire ward. In the supposed safe haven of British hospitals, they endlessly relived the nightmares of war. Most baffling of all was the state of dissociation. Soldiers would vanish from their post, not deserters in the traditional sense. Days later, they'd be found wandering aimlessly along French country lanes miles from the front, with no recollection of name, rank, or even the war itself. Their consciousness had executed a complete tactical retreat, erasing all unbearable details of existence. Like a blank canvas, a ghost in uniform, the ultimate expression of a soul choosing flight over fight. This is the multifaceted landscape of shell shock. It was not a single ailment, but a constellation of 100 symptoms. It was the body screaming. When the voice had failed, the nervous system overloaded and short-minus, circuited by the unprecedented industrialized violence of the First World War, the human spirit fracturing under pressures it was never meant to bear. This bewildering spectrum of symptoms, this epidemic of shattered soul, presented Britain's High Command with a crisis extending far beyond the medical sphere. It was a crisis of identity, a fundamental challenge to the very concept of martial masculinity that underpinned the entire British Army. Within the panelled offices of the War Office, in the chilly corners of headquarters where generals like Douglas Hape resided, the prevailing sentiment was not sympathy, but profound skepticism. These war strategists were products of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, upholding ideals of duty, endurance and so minus called moral fibre. A true man, an English warrior, must be steadfast, never weak, never break, never lose control. Therefore, this cohort of trembling, silent, paralyzed soldiers could not be a legitimate outcome of combat. There must be some other explanation, some form of failure. The dictionary of the Highcombe and assigned two labels to such failures: cowardice and malingering. Cowardice was the straightforward manifestation of a nervous breakdown in the face of the enemy. Despicable yet unambiguous malingering was more insidious, deliberately feigning illness to evade duty. Shell shock is invariably categorized among these moral failings. Soldiers trembling uncontrollably are not the sick, but those lacking self-restraint, the speechless, are not wounded, but deliberately silent to secure repatriation. Senior officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Mott, the Army's neurological advisor, insist true soldiers of sound upbringing and resolute will possess innate immunity to such symptoms. They declared this affliction assails only the constitutionally weak. War's pressures merely expose inherent frailties. This was deemed a stain of personal deficiency, not trauma inflicted by the enemy. This perspective held strategic significance. Commanders deeply feared that formally recognizing shell shock as a legitimate combat injury would have dire consequences. Even though this suffering was as honorable as wounds torn by shrapnel, they still feared the spread of contagious anxiety. If one man could retire due to nervous exhaustion, who could prevent an entire platoon or company from collapsing in succession, the army would disintegrate like an avalanche. This would legitimize the right of soldiers to break down, and an army that acknowledged the right to collapse would ultimately lose its combat effectiveness. This war, consuming vast logistical and human resources, cannot afford concessions to human frailty. The supply of brave men must be regarded as inexhaustible. This official military dogma is reinforced by the society that sends soldiers to battle. The ideal male figure of the time was expressionless, emotionally closed, physically robust, a patriot without complaint or regret. The soldier in khaki uniform embodied this ideal in its purest form, while shell shock sufferers represented its grotesque antithesis. They were deemed neither fully male nor female, hysterical, even effeminate, weeping, trembling, fainting, symptoms society associated with fragile, delicate women, not the standard equipment of an imperial hero. Thus emerged a suffocating stigma. Soldiers showing early signs of psychological distress would desperately conceal their symptoms, for fear of being branded cowards by their comrades. They dreaded the cold, dismissive stares in the trenches, the questioning glances of officers, and most of all, the shame of being seen as unable to bear the burden. They knew well that a diagnosis of shell shock meant a stain on their military career, the ruin of their reputation, a lifelong, irredeemable disgrace. This was tantamount to treason. These soldiers had been steeped since childhood in narratives of imperial glory, indoctrinated with a lofty mission of loyalty to monarch and nation. They answered the call, bearing burdens beyond endurance. Yet when they broke, the very system they served accused them of dereliction of duty, of soul-lying the barracks, of failing their comrades. The burden of proof rested entirely upon the soldiers. They had to demonstrate genuine illness rather than feigned malingering. Frontline medics faced immense pressure from superiors to suppress the diagnosis of shell shock. Their examinations were often fraught with suspicion and accusation. Without visible trauma, fraud became the default conclusion. Class played a crucial and deeply ironic role in this process. Officers from public schools exhibiting nightmares and anxiety were more likely to be diagnosed with neurasthenia, a fashionable euphemism for mental collapse, regarded as a gentleman's ailment, symbolizing an overstrained nervous system under command's weight. Yet working-class soldiers from Manchester factories displaying identical symptoms were routinely labelled hysterical. This term carried the pejorative connotations of femininity and pathology, or was outright dismissed as malingering. The diagnosis reflected both the patient's social standing and mirrored their state of health. The tragic irony lay in the very masculine culture demanding these men become tireless automatons, rendering them profoundly vulnerable when fear, grief, or terror found no acceptable outlet. These emotions inevitably erupted in catastrophic, pathological forms. A pressure cooker without a safety valve will eventually explode violently. Since diagnoses were viewed as moral failings rather than medical injuries, the treatments administered were punitive rather than curative. The core objective of the military medical system was not to heal broken souls, but to repair malfunctioning human units and return them to the battlefield with maximum efficiency. Empathy is a luxury the war machine cannot afford. Efficiency reigned supreme. The prevailing ideology at the time, particularly in the war's early stages, held that soldiers' wills were firmly shackled by fear, self minus pity, and must be reset through brief, intense shock, authoritative coercion, and painful impact. This cold logic spawned a series of horrifying so-called therapies. These euphemistically termed treatments were, in essence, elaborate tortures cloaked in the austere garb of medical science. Among them, the Faraday therapy stands as the most notorious. This primitive and brutal electrovacuum therapy was widely practiced in institutions such as the National Hospital for Paralysis and Epilepsy in Queen Square, London. Doctors like Lewis Allen became masters of this dark art. This doctor of absolute conviction and unshakable conviction documented his tortuous methods with chilling pride in his 1918 treatise, War Hysteria. His treatment was fundamentally a contest of wills, and he was determined to win this confrontation. When shell explosions rendered soldiers mute, patients were brought before him. The soldier was strapped to a chair. Dry-inosol batteries connected to the circuit. Metal electrodes were firmly pressed against both sides of the throat. Then Jalund initiated the treatment, directing a powerful, excruciating current straight to the patient's larynx. As the soldier writhed in agony, Jalund would command repeatedly in a stern, authoritative voice, "Speak. You must speak." The air reverberated with the hum of machinery and the patient's choking gasped. The entire procedure would last an hour or longer, with the intensity steadily escalating, until the soldier, crushed by agony, would barely utter a single word. Why Elland regarded this as victory. He once boasted of curing someone's aphasia with a single session. This was not proof of medical skill, but demonstration of how immediate, excruciating pain could break a traumatized mind. For patients with paralyzed limbs, electrodes were applied to useless arms or legs. Electric currents induced violent muscle spasms, accompanied by agonizing convulsions. Yet the doctor commanded movement. You can move it. This therapy was founded on coercion. Beyond electric shocks, Disciplinary treatment was standard practice. Its purpose was to make hospitalization more dreadful than the trenches. Patients were subjected to humiliating rituals, publicly berated by doctors and officers for lacking courage. They were strictly isolated, confined to small rooms containing only a Bible, forbidden to speak with or even see other patients. Rations were restricted to the bare minimum. The message was unambiguous. Your condition is a manifestation of weakness. You shall be punished for it until you resolve to recover. This treatment was often combined with work therapy, labor therapy. Patients were compelled to perform arduous, repetitive physical labor, digging trenches, smashing rocks, scrubbing floors, officially justified as distraction and restoration of masculine purpose. In reality, it was often another form of punishment, aimed at shattering the will of soldiers already at rock bottom. Even seemingly benign hypnosis was frequently wielded as a coercive tool. Doctors would first hypnotize the soldier, then subject them to intensive, forced hypnotic suggestions. You do not fear the shells. You possess a sense of duty. You shall return to your unit and fight valiantly. This approach, attempting to overwrite trauma through programming, essentially implants obedience to mask the fissures in the psyche. It must be noted, as the war persisted and the scale of psychological trauma became increasingly apparent, more enlightened therapies began to emerge. At the Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland, affectionately dubbed the Wive Ill by officer patients, W.H. R. Rivers and others pioneered what would later be termed talking therapy. Wounded poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen were encouraged to recount their traumatic experiences by exploring dreams and fears to comprehend and integrate their memories. This marked the nascent stage of psychoanalysis and represented a revolutionary departure from punitive treatments elsewhere. Rivers and his team understood that the mind cannot be forcibly cured. Their prescriptions included rest, occupational therapy, and most crucially, listening. Yet even within this final sanctuary of compassion, the ultimate goal remained brutal and pragmatic. The primary function of Craiglockhart Hospital, like all military hospitals, was to return soldiers to the battlefield. Rivers himself, a man of profound compassion, was profoundly tormented by this contradiction. As a physician, his duty was to heal, yet, as an officer of the Royal Army Medical Corps, his duty was to restore soldiers to a state fit for return to the battlefields that had shattered them. However gentle the treatment, it remained but a cog in the vast, cold machinery of the war effort. For tens of thousands of soldiers, the hospital was not a sanctuary, but the second battlefield within the war. Here invisible wounds drew not pity, but electric shocks, humiliation and commands to show more spirit. They were shattered by one form of industrialized violence, only to become victims of another, this time cloaked in the sterile garb of medicine, cold and ruthless, yet in the quiet, refined consulting rooms of London, in hastily converted country sanatoriums, another battle brewed. At its heart lies the very definition of trauma, while the general staff and mainstream medicine dismissed as cowardice or concussion. A small band of thoughtful doctors began to suspect the wound lay not in brain tissue, but deep within the soldier's memory. They pioneered a revolutionary new therapy, requiring no electricity, hydrotherapy or drill, merely a chair, a quiet room, and an extraordinary capacity to listen. Their proposed antidote was talk. This was the silent revolution initiated by psychoanalysts, piercing through trembling limbs and vacant stares, to unearth stories buried deep within the soul. Among them, the most influential figure was one whose background made him the natural choice for this extraordinary new endeavor. Captain William Hells Rivers, W.H. R. Rivers. Rivers was not a military doctor by profession, but an anthropologist and psychologist. Before the war, he had studied the vanishing cultures of remote islands in the Torres Strait, meticulously documenting the kinship structures and rituals of peoples on the other side of the globe. He was trained to observe, to listen and to comprehend world views utterly alien to his own. Now the foreign culture he was tasked with deciphering was that of traumatized British officers, men whose souls had been utterly warped by experiences beyond the framework of civilist understanding. Rivers first worked at the Mahale Military Hospital near Liverpool, before undertaking his most renowned practice at Craiglocheth Hospital in Scotland. Gradually challenging the prevailing orthodoxy of the time, he discovered that the symptoms of shell shock, nightmares, stammering, paralysis, were not random functional disorders. He argued these manifestations constituted a language, the body's desperate attempt to symbolically articulate terror, where consciousness was rendered speechless. He believed soldiers' experiences were so horrifying, and utterly at odds with their training and self-minus perception, that the psyche resorted to extreme measures for self-minus preservation, suppressing memories, burying unbearable trauma deep within the unconscious, locking it away from conscious thought. Yet the memory did not vanish. It festered in the darkness. This immense energy must find release in some form. It seeps out in distorted shapes. The trembling of hands that once held rifles, the stammering of voices that once gave orders, nightly nightmares replaying the deaths of comrades, repeated with perfect, agonizing rills. Orthodox therapy employed painful electrovoct to his treatment, implicitly accusing the patient of malingering, which only exacerbated the situation. It was akin to bellowing at someone speaking a foreign tongue, deluding oneself that volume could force understanding. This was a second layer of violence superimposed upon the original trauma. Rivers proposed a diametrically opposed approach. His method, termed talking therapy or self-minus awareness therapy, appeared deceptively simple. When necessary, he would converse with patients for hours, gently unpatiently guiding them to recount their memories. He cultivated an absolutely safe, non-minus judgmental space, enabling the officers to finally lower their defenses, shed their masks of stoicism, and confront memories they had desperately buried. His aim was to unearth the trauma, bring it into the open, examine, understand it, ultimately integrating it into the soldier's life narrative. This was an intellectual and emotional archaeology. He helped patients recognize that their symptoms were not signs of weakness or cowardice, but entirely logical, a near-minus rational response to constant vigilance against unseen snipers, the deafening roar of artillery fire, the horrifying sight of comrades vaporizing in an instant. Experiences far exceeding the limits of the human nervous system. Breakdown is not a moral failing, but a physiological dysfunction. Rivers discovered that when trauma is given unaimed a narrative framework, its power often diminishes. Nightmares may not vanish entirely, but one can comprehend their origins. A stammer may persist, yet the sufferer may begin to recognize it as an echo of a specific moment of terror, rather than a shameful and inexplicable torment. This is a slow and arduous process, demanding profound empathy from the clinician and immense courage from the patient. In a certain sense, it is as difficult as facing a hail of machine-minus gunfire. For many, acknowledging fear is more untouchable than death. Rivers granted them the right to reclaim their humanity. He did not labor alone. Charles Miles, who coined the term shell shock in the Lancet as early as 1915, and others had also advocated psychotherapy. Yet it was Rivers, with his quiet scholarly demeanor and profound respect for the patient's inner world, who became the silent emblem of this more humane form of medicine. He treated not merely symptoms, but listened to souls. In that listening, he paved the first steps towards peace of mind for his patients, a peace far beyond what almost assess could grant. This novel medical practice, this profound revolution of listening, demanded a wholly new form of hospital. It could not be a rigid institution for military-style training, nor a cold ward permeated by the scent of disinfectant and despair. It must become a sanctuary for the soul. Amidst the mist-shrouded hills above Edinburgh, such a sanctuary awaited its coming. It was called the Craiglocketh Sanatorium for officers with nervous disorders, though patients often simply called it the Spa. This name softly echoes its former days. Before the war, Craiglocketh Spa was a grand Victorian hotel where Scotland's upper middle classes came to recuperate, to drink the mineral waters, and breathe the fresh air. Grey stone towers stood imposing, over manicured lawns stretching wide, with sweeping vistas of the Pentland Hills. The building resembled a baron's castle, rather than a medical facility. After being requisitioned by the military in 1916, it transformed into the British Empire's most renowned treatments into for shell shock. The theories of William Herbert Trivers and others were applied here on a grand scale. Craiglocketh was not an asylum, but a sanctuary. The contrast with other military hospitals was deliberate and stark. No armed guards stood at the gates. There was no rigid hierarchy of drill masters and frightened soldiers. The patients were all officers, men crushed by the weight of command. The entire building was designed for healing. Echoing corridors, an elegant dining room encircled by large windows, a tranquil library still displaying pre-Innis-worn novels. A world apart from the muddy chaos of the trenches, attempting to reconstruct for these officers the civilized, orderly world they ostensibly fought for. A world they had begun to believe no longer existed. The logistical system operating this institution was ingeniously conceived, housing approximately 150 to 200 officer patients, supported by doctors, nurses and orderlies from the Royal Army Medical Corps. Yet the daily routine deliberately minimized military trappings. The typical schedule centered not on discipline, but on recuperation. Mornings were devoted to medical consultations, engaging in slow, arduous talk therapy during 1- to -1 sessions with doctors like Rivers. Engaging in slow, arduous conversations afternoons are reserved for prescribed rest or light activity. The expansive grounds form the heart of the healing landscape. Patients are encouraged to stroll the surrounding hills, reconnecting with nature's simple rhythms of recovery. They swing clubs on the adjacent course, the soft clack of mallet against bowl, offering a therapeutic counterpoint to the echoes of gunfire in their memories. They played tennis, fishing in the stream, and organizing photographic expeditions. This realm brims with purposeful, gentle distraction. Another pioneering physician at the hospital, Dr. Arthur Brock, pioneered a treatment called labor therapy. He believed trench trauma severed patients from life entirely, plunging them into passive, painful despondency. His solution was to encourage patients to reminisce the world through productive, even creative labor. He had them tend the hospital gardens, turning soil and sowing seeds, awakening the earth's vitality, yielding simple, grounded satisfaction. He guided them in studying local history, mapping flora across the surrounding areas, focusing attention on tangible, concrete details, a stark contrast to the chaos and emptiness of the front lines. Here every effort yielded clear, positive results. Seeds sown blossomed into flowers. Research findings became knowledge. This was the path to rebuilding the patient's sense of agency, restoring their belief that action could change the world. The hospital's intellectual life flourished unexpectedly. Lectures, debates, a meticulously managed library, and most significantly, the patient-run journal Hydra. The name carried classical black humor, derived from the mythical serpent whose severed heads grew to more, becoming a bleak metaphor for this endless war. Yet the journal itself becomes a vital therapeutic tool. It contains essays, witty sketches of hospital life, sports reports, and most crucially, poetry. It grants men a voice, offering a platform to process and share experiences within a community that truly understands them. The masthead aptly bears its motto: war, literature, age journal of art and idle chatter, where profound and trivial coexist, reflecting the peculiar reality of Craiglocketh Hospital, where men abated the finer points of golf swings at dawn, only to confront the ghosts of fallen comrades by afternoon. This encapsulated the contradictory mission of the Craiglockworth facility. Its official military directive was clear: to rehabilitate these physically and psychologically wounded officers and return them to the battlefield. Doctors are essentially psychological mechanics, charged with repairing the human machinery of the officer corps, so it may once more be deployed to slaughter. Yet their humane progressive therapies often yield profoundly different outcomes. While constructing sanctuaries of healing, they inadvertently foster breeding grounds for corruption. By encouraging soldiers to dissect the roots of their trauma, they guide these men towards incisive critiques of war itself. It was within this tranquil sanctuary, in that peculiar space where daily travail light us intertwined with intellectual exploration, that the most enduring testimony to the suffering of shell-shocked soldiers was not born in medical journals, but etched upon the pages of a poet's notebook. In the late summer of 1917, two men arrived at Craig Lockhart. Their destinies converged in this quiet cottage sanctuary. Both were privates in the British Army. Both were poets. Yet the similarities seemed to end there. One was already a decorated soldier of some renown. His name resounded across Britain, the other remained unknown. A shy, stammering youth, whose poetic gift was known only to himself and a handful of friends. Their meeting in the hospital's tranquil courtyard would rewrite British literary history, and forever reveal the truest face of industrialized warfare. They were Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. Siegfried Sassoon arrived first. Strictly speaking, he was not a casualty of shell shock. In the eyes of the military high command, he was the far more dangerous presence, the sane man in this mad world, determined to speak the truth. Sassoon had once been a brave and fearless officer, awarded the Military Cross for valor at the Battle of the Somme, dubbed Mad Jack for his repeated, near-minus, suicidal trench raids. Yet the endless attrition, the senseless slaughter, and the chauvinistic lies from home gradually eroded his faith in the war. In July 1917, he penned and published his famous Soldier's Manifesto, which delivered a scathing indictment of the war's continuation. The manifesto opened with the declaration, "I make this statement in defiance of military orders, for I am convinced that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it." This constituted astonishing moral courage. For a decorated serving officer to publicly voice such views was tantamount to treason. A court-martial seemed inevitable, yet the authorities understood expediency. Trying and imprisoning a beloved war hero would be a public relations catastrophe. The wiser course was to declare him insane, a victim of the very psychological trauma the military struggled to contain. With the assistance of his friend and writer Robert Graves, Sassoon was diagnosed with shell shock. He was promptly sent to Craiglockworth Hospital. This move aimed to suppress his protests and discredit his mental state. Weeks later, Wilfred Owen was also admitted to the same institution. Owen was the true casualty. He had been blown into the air by a trench mortar, spent days in a shell-minus hole alongside the dismembered remains of his comrades, later diagnosed with severe neurasthenia. The horrors of the front line haunted him. His speech was halting and punctuated by stammering. He was further tormented by what he termed the unspeakable pranks of war. He was introverted, sensitive and deeply traumatized throughout his years of poetic creation. His early works, however, were steeped in romanticism, imitating Keats' style. The ornate language proved utterly incapable of bearing the brutal realities he had witnessed. War had granted him grand and terrifying themes for his writing, yet he had yet to find an expression worthy of them. Their meeting stemmed from their shared attending physician, W.H.R. Rivers. But true healing occurred through their mutual exchange. Ewing admired Weston's published works and shyly introduced himself. Weston was initially cool, but was struck by the power and honesty contained within the young poet's drafts. Thus commenced an extraordinary mentor-disciple relationship. in the hospital's tranquil consultation rooms, during lengthy strolls through the gardens, at editorial meetings for Hydra, the journal briefly edited by Seymour. Seymour served as both a demanding editor and an ardent champion. He forged Owen's raw, soul-spacing experiences into poetry possessing earth-shattering force. He urged Irving to discard romantic affectation and write with brutal, uncompromising honesty. He taught Irving poetic techniques such as irony, alliteration, and metamorphosis. Yet these were merely tools to recreate the discordant, ugly sounds of the battlefield. Under Weston's tutelage, Irving's genius erupted. During his months convalescing at Craig minus a minus low chart, he composed or drafted with rare creative intensity the poems that would cement his immortal status. He wrote elegies for the fallen youth, opening with a line that seizes the soul. For these fallen souls, fallen like cattle, where is the tolling bell? Only the fury of the cannon's roar. This single line swept away centuries of romanticized notions of dying honorably on the battlefield. No tolling bells, no sacred hymns, no ceremonial rites, only the industrial clamor of a slaughterhouse. He composed "It is sweet to die for one's country." The title drew from the maxim of the Roman poet Horace. With clinical detachment, Owen depicted scenes of gas attacks, depicting soldiers drowning in their own lungs, concluding with searing fury. Had you witnessed this, you would not preach such fervent praise to youths craving illusory glory. The old lie to die for one's country is sweet. He himself composed poetry, yet his style was utterly distinct, more satirical, more furious, more direct, like a heavy blow to the gut. In poems like The General, he savagely satirises the incompetence of the high command in Does It Matter? He writes with biting pen about the clichés surrounding the wounded at home, but his greatest contribution during this period may well have been his influence on Owen. He recognized Owen possessed a deeper and more empathetic genius. Not only could he express rage, but also articulate compassion. Owen later wrote in the preface to his manuscript, "Poetry is compassion." These two, sheltered by the peculiar refuge of a Scottish asylum, gave voice to the voiceless. They voiced the silent screams of soldiers beneath shell fire. Their verse became medical literature, psychiatric case studies, rendered in perfect, unforgettable lines. They captured the sensory overload in the trenches, the creeping terror, the nightmarish trauma, the survivor's guilt, and the profound alienation from a civilian world forever beyond comprehension. Through poetry, they achieved what Rivers sought in psychotherapy, exposing repressed trauma to the light of day, giving it form and language, thereby beginning to master it. Their work at Craiglocketh Hospital ultimately became the most authentic and enduring anthem to the invisible casualties of that war. Having regained his peace, Owen soon chose to return to the front. When comrades fell on the battlefield, he could no longer fight on. He was wounded again, yet survived the war. Owen's fate epitomized the profound tragedy of this literary brotherhood, healed in the sanctuary's tranquility, regaining courage under Weston's guidance. He too was deemed fit for service. Despite Cecil's earnest pleas for him to remain behind the lines, Owen felt duty-bound to rejoin his unit. In the autumn of 1918, he once more set foot on the French battlefield, this time fully comprehending the horrors he would face, employing a fresh poetic language to depict the carnage. He was awarded the Military Cross for bravery during an October operation, 1 week before the November 1918 armistice. Wilfred Owen was cut down by machine-gun fire while leading his men across the Somme Canal at the age of 25, as bells tolled in his hometown church to celebrate the war's end. A telegram delivered the news of his death to his parent. His poetry, bearing the trauma of a generation, was published posthumously. Their power and compassion forever reshaped our understanding of this war and all wars. When the military machine encounters a faulty component, its ultimate, cold logic is not repair, but disposal. When tremors grow ever more violent, when silence becomes a roar, when soldiers can no longer rush towards the sound of gunfire. The system delivers its final, programmed solution. This was known as the Field Military Tribunal. The venues were seldom solemn, draughty barns, requisitioned farmhouse parlors, tents behind the front lines. The roar of artillery served as an eternal drumbeat, reminding the world that the accused had been utterly destroyed. A tribunal table, a few officers acting as judges, their faces weary and agitated. The accused often sunken by the side, still trembling, their uniforms hanging loosely like theatrical costume. The charges are typically crude and brutal, yet carry biblical weight. Cowardice in the face of the enemy, or its close kin. Desertion. These terms belong to another age. An age of cavalry charges and crimson uniforms. An age when heroism could decide victory in an afternoon. In the trenches on battlefields of nameless, industrial slaughter. These terms have no place. Here courage is no longer a singular, glorious deed, but day after day, week after week, a sombre, monotonous entrance of the unbearable. Yet the old words and old laws persist. The British Army's Code of Military Justice explicitly states, "The crime of cowardice shall be punished by death." Thus the machinery of military justice turned as routinely as ever, processing soldiers' breakdowns with the same efficiency as tinned-befind ammunition boxes. The numbers themselves tell the story. Throughout the entire war, over 3,000 men in the British Expeditionary Force were sentenced to death for such offences. The vast majority of these death sentences were ultimately commuted by commanding officers to long terms of hard labour, itself a living death. But not all were spared. At dawn, 346 soldiers from Britain and its colonies were led from their cells, bound to posts, and executed by firing squads often composed of their comrades. This was not a uniquely British phenomenon. The French army executed over 600 soldiers in a widely documented campaign. Under General Cud or Nazian discipline, the Italian army executed more than 700. Though precise figures for German and Austro-Hungarian forces remain unverifiable, such executions were widespread. Military authorities deemed them essential command tools, a grim form of personnel management. Trials were typically rushed and perfunctory. Soldiers might be arrested at dawn, tried by afternoon, and sentenced by dusk. Legal representation was largely nominal. Defendants were assigned a comrade, typically a junior officer with no legal training. The accused had merely an hour to prepare their defense, and were often too mentally shattered to present their case. Even medical evidence submitted was frequently disregarded. A surgeon's diagnosis might note neurasthenia or absence, but this ultimately contended against the testimony of a sergeant who witnessed desertion within the calculations of rigid military discipline. The act itself became the sole criterion. Motivation was a dangerous luxury of no consequence. The High Command, particularly figures like Field Marshal Sir Douglas Hay, viewed it as simple cause and effect. Hay possessed profound conviction and unshakable faith. He held discipline to be the absolute bedrock of the military. Should one man be permitted to refuse an order to hesitate, the entire system might collapse. In his view, execution, though regrettable, was an indispensable psychological weapon against one's own troops. The dread of the firing squad must exceed the fear of the enemy. He once wrote that a single execution could salvage the morale of an entire battalion. This was a strategic choice. Each soldier was but a minute data point in a brutal equation. Take Private Harry Farr, for instance. He was neither a conscript nor a green-clad youth, but a career soldier who enlisted in 1908. He fought with the 1st Expeditionary Force in the desperate battles of 1914 at Montmartre and Apollo. He endured the war's most brutal trials. By 1916, his body and spirit were shattered. Admitted 5 times for severe nervous disorders, his body convulsed with uncontrollable tremors. The artillery roar had rendered him deaf. That September, his unit was ordered to the Somme front. Far, then a dispatch rider was incapacitated, his limbs utterly beyond his command. He was sent to a field hospital, but of cursory examination, the military doctor declared him fit and sent back to his unit. When he still refused to return to the front, he was arrested. At the court-martial, the military doctor testified that Farr's tremors could, to quote him directly, be controlled by his own willpower. Farr was ultimately convicted of cowardice. His wife Gertrude, far behind the lines, pleaded desperately, sending letters on proof of his service. Well, the sentence stood. At dawn on 18 October 1916, Private Harry Farr was executed near Carolway, France. His weakness lay not in resolve, but in a body that could bear no more terror. Yet the military justice system showed no tolerance. Consider Royal Navy officer Edwin Did, a veteran of Jutland's hellish battlefields, suffered a complete nervous breakdown after the war. He was transferred to the Royal Marine Division for service in France. Fully aware this was a world away from the sea, during a fierce bombardment, late 1817, he abandoned his post and went AWOL for several days. His prior medical history was well documented. His mental collapse at Jutland was a matter of record, yet the court-martial remained unyielding. Officers must uphold higher standards. His breakdown was deemed not a medical crisis, but a catastrophic dereliction of leadership, endangering his men. He too was executed. When corps discipline was challenged, the system regarded rank as irrelevant. The execution proceeded with chilling bureaucratic formality. The condemned man was granted a final meal, served rum to drink. The chaplain recited scripture. Then a brief walk in the pre-minus dawn gloom. 12 executioners, pale minus-faced. By tradition, one rifle held a blank cartridge, ensuring none knew for certain if they fired the fatal shot. This trifling mercy extended even to the executioners, much less the condemned. The military doctors stood ready to confirm death. Official records sent home were often deliberately vague. Families word all their sons had been killed in action or succumbed to their wounds. This was done with good intentions, to spare them public humiliation and street gossip. Yet this lie concealed a cruel economic blow. Families of soldiers executed for cowardice lost their pensions. Their lives were severed alongside their sons. Not only did they endure grief, but they were plunged into destitution and a secret they could never speak of. This was the final administrative procedure, stripping them of all human dignity. The ultimate price paid for that invisible wound, which, unseen, was therefore disbelieved. For those who were not executed, but bore an equally invisible trauma, the war did not end at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. The signing of the armistice brought no deliverance, merely shifting their private war to a different battlefield. Troop transports carried them from France across the churning Grey Channel towards a homeland ecstatic with liberation. Celebrations erupted like a plague across the streets of London and Paris, an outpouring of joy and hope. Yet for many soldiers in khaki uniforms, as they gazed from the windows of the military trains upon the cheering crowds, what welled up was not joy, but a profound and unsettling sense of alienation. They had returned to their homeland, yet no longer belonged to it. The world they had left for years prior no longer existed. Worse still, the selves they had been when they departed were gone forever. Those souls buried in the muddy trenches of Passchendaele or the chalky battle-miners gullies of the Somme. The homeland to which they returned failed to honor the stirring promises of Prime Minister David Lloyd George. There was no land prepared for the heroes. The reality was crushing war debts, a nation ravaged by economic collapse and mass unemployment. The vast war machine that had sustained millions ground to a halt almost overnight. Factories that had churned out shells and rifles now lay silent. Between 1919 and 1920, millions of demobilized soldiers flooded the labor market, yet found no place Competition for jobs was fierce. Even able minus-bodied men struggled to find work. Those pale miners faced, shivering, slurring their words. Wounded soldiers, still haunted by the trenches, had scarcely any chance. Employers sought robust, dependable labor, not defective goods. Yet the true battlefield, not in job centers, but within the terraced houses and flats where these soldiers attempted to rebuild their lives. Here, the invisible shell shock festered silently, poisoning everything it touched. The most common symptom was suffocating silence. They could not recount what they had seen or done, let alone speak of the wounds inflicted upon them. No language bridges the chasm between trench cruelty and civilian tranquility. Loved ones, filled with affection and goodwill, ask, "What was it like over there?" This is fundamentally an unanswerable question. How to describe the screech of shells before impact? How to describe the stench of poison gas and decay? How to describe the endless error? How to describe comrades vaporizing before your eyes? To speak is to relive. Reliving is madness. So they remain silent. At supper, they sit at the table, their hearts miles away, their gaze fixed on emptiness, a gaze that has lasted 1,000 years. Night is war's other continuation. They wake drenched in sweat, wrestling unseen foes in the dark. Their screams rouse wives and children. Sleep offers no release, only the replay of nightmares. The daylight world is strewn with anxiety inducing trap. The backfire of a car exhaust on the street is enough to send them, and diving beneath the kitchen table, a door slamming may trigger uncontrollable rage. During thunderstorms, it feels like enduring a barrage of artillery fire. These men live in a state of perpetual, exhausting hypervigilance, their nervous systems permanently locked in high alert mode, awaiting an assault that never comes, yet perpetually looms. This phantom war inflicts horrific trauma upon their families. The wife who waited for years for her husband's return finds herself living with a stranger. The gentle, smiling husband of yesteryear no longer exists, replaced by a sullen, irascible, alienated, cold, and oft unterrifying stranger. He may be unable to hold down a job, plunging the family into poverty. He often drowned his sorrows in drink, seeking in the bottle the oblivion sleep denied him. Domestic violence, a topic scarcely mentioned in those days, quietly spread through these veterans' households. Children grew amidst fear and confusion, tiptoeing to avoid a father who was both pitiable and terrifying. The family, the bedrock of society, crumbled under the immense, unaccountable pressure of unaccountable trauma. At the societal level, these men drifted like castaways, often drawn to one another, gathering in pubs or newly formed British Veterans Association branches. Here, at least, they needed no explanations. A glance, a nod sufficed. They understood without words. Yet these gatherings could become echo chambers for trauma. Collective drinking only deepens despair. Within the wider community, they are often viewed as both pitiable and suspect. Madmen, lazy good minus for minus nothing, men incapable of pulling themselves together. Mental illness itself carries a heavy stigma. It is seen as moral failing, character weakness, rather than medical condition. Admitting to neurasthenia equates to admitting one is not man enough. The most severe cases were ultimately consigned to county asylums. These were not the sanatoriums of later times, but vast, imposing Victorian prison minus-like edifices, more akin to penitentiaries than places of healing, such as the West Yorkshire Pauper Asylum at Menston, or London's Cane Hill Sanatorium. Thousands of veterans thus vanished from society, diagnosed with war neurosis or post-war dementia. Treatment methods were primitive and often brutal. Hydrotherapy involved swaddling patients in icy wet cloths for hours, or dousing them with high pressure water. Jets electrotherapy, a crude precursor to electroshock therapy, alongside deep sedation using bromides and barbiturates, plunged them into a chemical haze. These institutions were not built to heal, but to confine. To manage the troublesome remnants of war, desperate families sent them here, often to be imprisoned for life, their identities gradually eroded, their names forgotten by the outside world. The tranquility and peace of the post-war years for hundreds of thousands of men across Europe proved an illusion. They remained on the battlefield. The only difference now was fighting alone in the darkness. Their enemy lurked within their own consciousness. When family bonds unraveled, and society met them only with suspicion, the sole institution veterans could turn to was the very nation that had sent them to war, to secure official recognition of their suffering and obtain compensation. They embarked upon a desperate and arduous struggle. This exhausting campaign became the ultimate journey for an entire generation. It was a protracted battle for pensions. No bullets or bayonets on this battlefield, only paperwork and forms, medical hearings and bureaucratic indifference. Their adversaries a vast, newly established government department, the War Pensions Department, created in 1916 to address unprecedented casualties. By the 1922s, it had become one of the largest and most powerful departments within Britain's state apparatus. Its function was dual: to distribute pensions to those entitled, but also to guard against fraudulent or exaggerated claims to protect the exchequer. In those debt-ridden post-war years, the latter often took precedence over the former. The crux lay in evidence. When scars left no trace, how could the wounded prove their injuries were genuine? Claims from amputees were indisputable. Evidence of sacrifice lay starkly before them. Gas victims could undergo long examination, yet shell-shock sufferers possessed only their own testimony. Tremors, nightmares, paralyzing anxiety. These subjective symptoms deeply troubled officials. They could be feigned. The entire system thus rested upon deep-seated suspicion. The burden of proof fell entirely upon the veteran. He must not only demonstrate his illness, but also that the illness stemmed entirely and directly from their service experience. To this end, the Department of Veterans Affairs developed an extremely specific and carefully curated terminology system. In 1917, the military formally abandoned the term shell shock. The department actively discouraged its use. The term was discarded as overly vague, prone to misinterpretation, and implying a direct causal link to combat. The government was unwilling to fully acknowledge such a link. Instead, it favored more ambiguous and less culpable phrasing. Patients' symptoms might be categorized as neurasthenia, a pre-war term popularly used to diagnose nervous exhaustion, or diagnosed as disturbed cardiac function (DAH), locating the cause at the somatic level, even when no actual cardiac issues were found. Most insidiously, military doctors often attributed soldiers' mental breakdowns to pre-existing neurasthenia or constitutional defect. This constituted a masterful bureaucratic ploy, suggesting the individual was already physically and mentally impaired before donning uniform. War might have been the trigger for the collapse, but not its fundamental cause. Consequently, state responsibility was diminished or even entirely absolved. Pension benefits might be reduced, or, more commonly, outright denied. The process of claiming a pension proved arduous and humiliating. The claimant must appear before a pension appeals tribunal for interrogation. This was no casual chat with sympathetic doctors, but a thorough cross-examination. He faced a tribunal of stern officials, lawyers, officers and doctors, scrutinized records and conduct cross-examination. They dissect his statements clause by clause, questioning event dates, locations and symptom details. When probing family medical history, they deliberately seek any pre-war signs of mental instability. Medical examinations often become mere formalities, serving only to find physiological evidence for psychological disorders. Doctors tap knees to check reflexes, listen to heart, declare him physically fit upon finding no organic pathology. the veteran finds himself in a classic catch-22 predicament. If he presents a calm, coherent account, the committee may deem his articulation clear, and thus not genuinely incapacitated. If he breaks down under interrogation pressure, stammering resurfaces or hands tremble, they will dismiss him as an unreliable witness, deeming his testimony tainted by emotional state. This battle cannot be fought alone. Veterans began to organize. The Royal British Veterans Association, formed in 1921 from several small societies, became the most powerful advocate. The association's branches became lifeline. They appointed pension commissioners. These commissioners mastered the intricate regulations of government departments, assisting comrades in filling endless forms, and instructed them on presenting their cases before tribunals. They gathered data, compiled testimonies, and began lobbying Parliament. They coalesced thousands of personal tragedies into a formidable political force, demanding the nation honor its debt to these shattered soldiers. But the establishment resisted. In 1820, the government established the War Office Committee on Shell Shock, chaired by Lord Southborough. Many veterans pinned their hopes upon this inquiry, believing such a formal, high-level investigation would finally acknowledge the validity of their ailments. Yet the final report, published in 1922, delivered a thunderbolt, while verbally acknowledging the reality of psychological trauma. Its conclusions proved extremely conservative and reactionary. It recommended a complete ban on the term shell shock in official documents, attributing the root causes to so-called congenital defects and moral deficiencies. It reinforced the narrative that most cases represent disciplinary failings rather than legitimate medical conditions. This Southborough report was, in essence, a political document cloaked in scientific language. It provided the Department of Veterans Affairs with official cover to continue its policy of systems and denial. Behind the complex medical terminology and bureaucratic procedures lay stark economic realities. The nation simply could not afford the cost of fully acknowledging the problem. By the mid-1920s, war pensions constituted a substantial portion of government expenditure. Full recognition of shell shock as a widespread, legitimate, and compensable war injury would entail liability for hundreds of thousands of soldiers as an astronomical cost. From the Treasury's perspective, each application rejected by the Pensions Department represented a victory in official responsibility. The health of the national budget was prioritized over that of veterans. Through sheer tenacity and sustained support from organizations like the British Disabled Veterans Association, some wounded soldiers ultimately prevailed in their struggle. They secured meagre pensions of a few shillings per week to preserve dignity and sustain survival. Yet many more were denied such outcomes. They were crushed by bureaucratic red tape, intimidated by tribunal proceedings, or abandoned their fight in despair, drifting through poverty for the remainder of their days, shifting between odd jobs and workhouses, dependent on the care of their tormented families or reliant on charitable handouts. For this vast cohort, the Great War never ended. This unfinished peace felt like a life sentence, and the bureaucratic battle for pensions was their final trench warfare, that bitter taste of the nation's indifference. The recognition they fought for only truly arrived 8 decades later, by which time the last survivors lay long buried. 11 November 1918, at the 11th hour, the guns along the Western Front finally fell silent, a silence so profound, so absolute, it seemed to take physical form. Those soldiers who had endured years within the ceaseless storm of bombardment now stood within a world of silence. They heard birdsong, heard the wind through the withered remnants of what had been forest, heard the moans of the wounded. Of course, these sounds had never truly vanished, but the thunder of artillery, that industrialized, world-sending symphony of artillery, had finally drawn to a close. For millions of soldiers, the war was over, yet for hundreds of thousands, This silence was merely a new battlefield. The clamor that once filled the outside world now invades their inner souls with deafening thunder. They pack their belongings, board trains and ships, carrying war as an invisible passenger on their journey home. Yet their homelands are ill-minus prepared to receive them. Society holds specific, carefully constructed expectations for returning soldiers. They should be triumphant heroes, strong and robust, perhaps missing a limb. Such acceptable, visible sacrifice would earn them pensions and public sympathy. But when the sound of a door closing made an unblemished man flinch, when he stared into the void for hours, reliving memories his family could never comprehend, a man who would wake with a start, tossing and turning in sweat-soaked sheets, battling spectres in the quiet English bedroom. This was not in the script. This was unsettling, an inconvenient truth. The British called it keeping up the front. The French had their own understanding of masculine dignity. The Germans, defeated and facing national humiliation, had even less time for displays of apparent weakness. The expectations were simple. You survived. Now shut up. Get on with it. Thus the trauma burrows underground, seeping into the foundations of family life, becoming a silent corrosive. These men's children become astute observers, microseismologists of domestic tension. They master the silent art of not disturbing their father, learn to recognize the distant look in his eyes, which signifies he is not truly present, but has returned to some trench near pause -d Calais. They understand certain topics are forbidden. That great war lay sealed like a bound tome, its horrors locked behind a wall of harsh silence. Yet war was everywhere. It lurked in the father's sudden, inexplicable rage over a spilled milk glass, in his long, sullen silences at the dinner table, in his inability to express affection, and his powerlessness to forge emotional bonds with the family he fought for. Thus was born a new kind of inheritance, not property or wealth, but trauma. This legacy was not passed through a will, but through 1,000 moments of fear, confusion, and emotional estrangement. When the son witnessed his father's trembling hands, he learned a peculiar lesson about becoming a man, what horrors the world harbors, and how one must bear them in silence. This private agony resonated powerfully in the public literary sphere. Artists and writers dubbed the Lost Generation shouldered the task of voicing truths their fathers and brothers could not speak. In Britain, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, long before the war's end, had torn open the trenches' brutal reality through verse. Following Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front presented the German perspective to the world. This tale of profound disillusionment resonated across former enemy lines. In America, Ernest Hemingway sculpted emotionally scarred souls with concise, incisive prose. These were the disillusioned, forged in the crucible of war, who found the peace world hollow and superficial. These were not heroic sagas, but narratives of survival and its bitter cost. An entire generation sought to chart the boundaries of this invisible wound, exposing the psychological trauma deliberately concealed by parades and victory medals. For these veterans, the peacetime bureaucracy itself became another war. Britain's War Pension Board was inundated with applications. By the early 1922s, over 300,000 soldiers received disability pensions for nervous disorders including neurasthenia. Yet securing these pensions was itself a battle. Claimants had to prove their ailments originated from or were aggravated by military service. This system, devised by those who never saw combat, served veterans struggling to articulate their experiences. A panel of doctors in a modest London office had to determine whether a former miner's night terrors stemmed from shell explosions at the Battle of the Pyres, or from an inherent, so minus called character flaw. Many were turned away. Many chose to give up. They were abandoned to fend for themselves, scraping a living with minds no longer reliable, nerves perpetually on edge. They became the silent figures at the far end of the pub, shadows retreating into the room's corners. Their silence, stands as a monument, etched with the walls society strives to forget. Yet the echoes of cannon fire, they who possess astonishing vitality. It reverberates through families, shaping the next generation. And these children are summoned in short measure to fight their own wars, burdened by their father's spectres. The 20-1-year truce between the wars was but a long, fruitless slumber for military psychiatry. Institutions once forced to manage epidemics of shell shock reverted, like all vast bureaucracies, to routine once the crisis receded. Files archived, lessons forgotten. Hospitals like Craig-Lockard and McGare are reverted to civilian youth. Doctors like Mills and Rivers returned to academic life. Once the immediate pressures receded, mainstream opinion quietly reverted to old, comfortable prejudices. Shell shock was merely a product of that particular war, a product of trench warfare and static front lines. Everyone was certain the next war would be utterly different. It would be a war of manure, an era of errant tank warfare. The conditions that had spawned shell shock would vanish. This assumption seemed perfectly logical, yet proved catastrophically flawed. When the world plunged into war once more in 1939, the spectre of 1914 had already taken root. Among the soldiers of the Second World War, many were sons of veterans who had fought in the First. They had grown up in the shadow of trauma, only to now confront their own wounds. It soon became apparent that the psychological breaking point of soldiers bore scant relation to the nature of warfare. Whether crouching in trenches under artillery fire, or dodging German anti-man anti-aircraft fire in bombers, the human nervous system has its limits. When breakdowns occurred, the symptoms bore an eerily similar resemblance. Trembling, glassy mind-aside stare, aphasia, nightmares, but this could no longer be called shell shock. The term bore too deep an imprint of the previous war, laden with negative connotations of cowardice and hysteria. A new designation is urgently required, one with greater medical precision, more manageable and less terrifying. The British and Americans ultimately settled on a series of bland, almost bureaucratic euphemisms: combat fatigue, campaign weariness, war neurosis. The selection of these terms served a clear strategic purpose. They medicalize the condition, positioning it as a temporary state of exhaustion, like a depleted battery. Its meaning was self-evident: a brief period of recuperation, nutritional replenishment, encouragement, and the battery could be recharged and returned to service. The primary objective was not necessarily safeguarding the soldier's long-term psychological well-being, but conserving military manpower. Each soldier able to return to the front meant one less replacement from the rear requiring training. This was a purely cold-hearted logistical calculation. Precisely for this reason, a profoundly influential new therapeutic doctrine emerged: frontline psychiatry. To U.S. Army psychiatrists, Roy G. Rinker and John Spiegel pioneered this approach. After studying the immense pressures endured by American pilots during missions in North Africa and Italy, they distilled it into three simple principles: the PIIE principles: proximity, immediacy, predictability. Treatment must occur near the front lines, rather than distant rear hospitals. It must be administered immediately upon symptom onset, and it must be grounded in the expectation that soldiers are not diseased, but merely exhausted, and will soon rejoin their comrades. This stands in stark contrast to the First World War model, where soldiers diagnosed with shell shock were enter a lengthy chain of medical stations and hospitals. This process often reinforced their identity as casualties, effectively ending their military careers. Frontline mental health care kept soldiers amidst the artillery fire, within their social and military units, reinforcing the perception that they were still soldiers, not invalids. Treatment methods were often straightforward: a day or two of sedatives, hot food rations, opportunities to recount traumatic experiences, followed by a firm pact on the back and return to the front. This approach proved remarkably effective in getting soldiers back into combat. Whether it healed deeper psychological wounds remains a subject for future examination. That day would eventually arrive, though it would require waiting several more decades. This utilitarian, assembly-line approach to mental health stood in stark contrast to the attitudes of other belligerents. In Nazi Germany, an obsession with strengthened ideological purity virtually excluded the concept of psychological trauma. Soldiers who collapsed were seldom regarded as patients, but rather as traitors betraying the National Socialist ideal, and perceived as weak links on the front line. The consequences could be brutal, ranging from the disgrace of demotion to execution. In the Soviet Union, the totality of the Eastern Front campaign, a war of annihilation, meant the Red Army had no capacity to address individual soldiers' mental states. Collective needs in the nation's survival took precedence over all else. While the existence of stress was acknowledged, formal psychiatric care was minimal. The primary treatment was ideological indoctrination, rigorous discipline, and the harsh reality of fighting a relentless enemy. After 1945, the world entered a new era of Cold War and proxy conflicts. The lessons of combat fatigue work carried into the bitter, snow-bound landscapes of the Korean War. The terminology remained unchanged, while the principles of frontline psychology were refined. Fundamental understanding had yet to achieve a definitive breakthrough. Such a breakthrough required a different kind of war, a war that blurred all boundaries, a war that brought trauma home through entirely new political means. That war was the Vietnam War. Vietnam had no clear front lines. The enemy could lurk anywhere. In villages, in tunnels, behind trees. The rear areas offered no security. Threats were ever present. A constant, low frequency hum of anxiety, pierced intermittently by extreme terror. The 1-year service system DROS estimated date of return overseas fostered a peculiar psychological mechanism. The soldiers' primary objective was no longer winning the war, but simply enduring 365 days. They fought as individuals, counting down their personal calendars, often feeling detached from the war's strategic goals. When their service ended, one day they would be picked up from the jungle. Within 40-8 hours, they might stand on their hometown street corner. Without gradual psychological adjustment, without the shared journey home with comrades to process battlefield trauma, from a world of constant vigilance and mortal peril, they plummet abruptly into a peaceful, yet oft unhostile reality. This transition shatters both mind and spirit. Unlike the World War veterans who returned as triumphant heroes, Vietnam veterans faced a divided and angry homeland. What greeted them were not victory parades, but protest marches. They became symbols of this deeply unpopular war. Their sacrifices were ignored, even scorned. This sense of social isolation, this experience of returning home without welcome or recognition, ultimately became a deadly poison. It blocked the normal process of psychological healing and social reintegration. The trauma brought back from the jungles of Southeast Asia found no outlet, and gradually worsened. Soldiers tossed restlessly in their beds, tormented by intrusive memories or flashbacks, becoming irritable, short-tempered and emotionally numb. Estranged from their families, they numbed themselves with alcohol and drugs. The psychiatric community was initially at a loss. This was fundamentally different from previous combat fatigue. Symptoms often emerged months or even years after discharge, a chronic, intractable condition rather than temporary exhaustion. Civilians dubbed it the Vietnam Syndrome, yet veterans refused to conceal their suffering. Groups like the Vietnam Veterans Against the War emerged, politically astute and articulate. They understood personal trauma touched upon public issues. A handful of sympathetic psychiatrists became their allies, foremost among them Robert J. Lifton. He studied the psychological impact of extreme experiences. Meanwhile, Shane coined the term for this condition in his New York Times M70 to color. This designation precisely captured the essence of the trauma. He termed it post-traumatic stress disorder. The struggle to secure official recognition for this diagnosis proved a protracted and arduous campaign. This battle was fought in academic journals and psychiatric conferences. Lobbying efforts targeted influential figures within the American Psychiatric Association. Veterans and their allies presented compelling arguments that their symptoms were not innate personality flaws, nor manifestations of personal weakness, but normal reactions to extraordinarily harrowing experiences. These were the invisible scars of war trauma. After years of testimony, research and relentless advocacy, they ultimately prevailed. In 1980, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition DSM-II, formally incorporated post-traumatic stress disorder PTSD into its diagnostic framework. This landmark moment marked the culmination of a journey that began 65 years earlier in Flanders' muddy, shell-scarred fields. The formal clinical description in DSM-III represented the ultimate destination of this quest. Its core definition lies in the emergence of specific symptoms following exposure to psychological trauma exceeding human endurance. This definition provided final, silent vindication for every soldier who had trembled, offered a final, silent vindication. The medical authorities' formal recognition of trauma's validity placed the root cause in the event itself, rather than the individual. The protracted debate initiated by Charles Milne and his patients was finally settled. The recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder was far more than a mere change of terminology. It marked the culmination of a long, painful journey that began with the first bewildered, trembling soldiers of the First World War. It signifies a fundamental and permanent shift in humanity's understanding of war's psychological toll. The First World War, with its unprecedented scale of industrialized slaughter, spawned an epidemic of psychological trauma, to which the medical and social systems of the time were utterly unprepared. This war served as the crucible forging modern concepts of trauma. Every contemporary debate on veterans care, every mental health screening program implemented by modern armies, and every support group established for soldiers returning from Iraq or Afghanistan is founded upon the experiences of those shell-shocked soldiers of 1916. These lessons are etched into their suffering, into their unspoken stories, into the silent despair of their post-war lives. We learn it at terrible cost, that the battlefield is not merely an arena for physical combat, but also a crucible for the spirit. The ravages of psychological trauma are no less severe than shrapnel wounds, yet the path to healing is far more arduous. From shell shocks adjusting physical blast effects, to combat fatigue implying temporary exhaustion, to the clinically diagnosed enduring trauma of PTSD, the evolution of this concept reflects humanity's slow and laborious education about the nature and limits of psychological resilience. The vacant stare of that Marine in the Fallujah photograph mirrors the frozen gaze of British soldiers on Salisbury Plain during the First World War. The names have changed, the uniforms differ, the battlefields shift, yet the essence of trauma remains unchanged. This is the defining wound of modern warfare. This profound realization has fundamentally reshaped military doctrine. The clumsy and brutal trial minus error methods of the First World War have been superseded by systematic proactive mental health interventions. Modern armies screen recruits for psychological vulnerability, provide stress management training prior to deployment, and integrate psychiatrists and mental health teams directly into combat units. This represents a direct evolution of the psychological medical systems deployed on the front lines of the Second World War. These units, known as combat stress control teams, are dedicated to the immediate identification and treatment of stress, post-related trauma, preventing their progression into chronic conditions. Post-deployment. Current protocols include structured debriefing and reintegration programs designed to ease the challenging transition back to civilian life. This addresses the very failure that proved catastrophic for Vietnam War veterans. We have not solved the problem. PTSD and suicide rates among veterans remained alarmingly high, but we no longer deliberately turn a blind eye. At least we have begun the right conversation. Yet the most profound legacy of this enduring initiative may lie in how the concept of trauma has transcended battlefield boundaries. The PTSD diagnosis, originally developed to describe soldiers' experiences, has gifted the world a new language for understanding suffering. It constructs a cognitive framework where clusters of symptom, intrusive memories, avoidance behaviors, hypervigilance, emotional numbness resonate equally with survivors of diverse catastrophes, sexual assault survivors, childhood abuse survivors, natural disaster survivors, and survivors of major accidents. This invisible scourge, once deemed uniquely military, ultimately became the key in locking humanity's universal condition. It taught us that the essence of trauma is independent of its cause. It universalized the concept of invisible wounds. Thus, the story of shell shock did not end in 1918, nor does it conclude with the publication of the 1980 medical manual. This narrative continues to unfold in the hushed consultations of psychotherapist offices, within the policy debates of national governments, in every veteran struggling to rebuild their life after war. The First World War forced the modern world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that one might survive the conflict, yet ultimately be consumed by it, that the most deafening explosions do not necessarily inflict the deepest wounds. Sometimes the deadliest sound is the echo that lingers after the war, that silent reverberation replaying in the theater of the mind. The 1918 armistice silenced the battlefields of Europe, but began a long, arduous journey of listening. We are listening to those silent casualties, listening to the echoes of gunfire that still reverberate today.